Welcome to Disunion, the Government Union Report, the podcast where we delve into the ever-evolving landscape of public sector labor policy and law. Steve Dealey is the Director of Labor Policy at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. In this role, he's in charge of researching, developing, and promoting labor reforms through studies, commentary, speaking, media relations, and legislative testimony. He also serves as a policy advisor for a couple of projects called Workers for Opportunity and My Pay, My Say. He's a graduate of Hillsdale College with a degree in political science, and he has his JD from Michigan State University College of Law. Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David.
So, Steve, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics recently published some data from 2024 suggesting that the union membership rate continues to fall in both the private and the public sectors. In the private sector, it's gone down from 6 to 5.9%, and in the public sector, it's gone down from 32.5 to 32.2%. And, both of those numbers are relatively small percentage decreases, but they happen to be part of a downward trend over many years since these things have been measured in the 1980s for the private sector and around 2000 for the public sector. So I brought Steve on to talk a little bit about these trends and to provide some explanation for why this is happening. So Steve, let's talk about the private sector first. I follow the NLRB and news about unionization all the time. And what I hear in the news about the NLRB, like Biden's friendliness to unions, for example, and news about Amazon and Starbucks and the auto industry, if I were just reading that news, I would have been led to believe that unionization was at an all-time high, or at least an increase over last year. But here it is. It's falling just like it has for ages. So how do you explain the fall of private sector unions, even since the 80s?
Sure. I probably read many of the same publications and I see the same thing. And then lo and behold, December, January of every year, there's a small little news report that says, actually, it's gone down any further. And I don't think that trend has changed since the 80s because unions, particularly in the private sector, have not done a very good job, in my mind, of evolving to meet the needs of what workers need in a modern workforce. Unions still very much operate as if it's the 1950s or earlier, where workplace safety, extremely low wages, extremely long hours are a common feature, and that's just not the case anymore. Since the 80s, we've had laws that have kind of taken over a lot of those areas of the workplace. We have OSHA, we have safety standards, we have wage and hour laws, and so that traditional role of a union has been consistently eroded. And what we're seeing now is public employees not liking the union model. I mean, it's a model that's based on coercion, on mandatory fees, on, instances where you have to choose between paying a union and keeping your job. And they're seeing unions not be as effective for them as they would like. And I think they're just recognizing the value proposition isn't there. I can get more on my own.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. So let's move to the public sector, and as we're doing that, I guess one of the things that's most obvious about these reports every year is that union membership rates for the public sector are something like 5 times higher than the private sector. So you've described this downward trend in the private sector. The public sector experiencing the same trend, but still the membership rate is much, much higher. So what's going on there? Why are public sector unions seeming to thrive while private sector unions are just middling in their performance?
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I'd say they're thriving, although I would certainly agree they're doing significantly better than the private sector component. But public sector unions have a structure that the private sector does not. No matter what, let's say the UAW wants to get out of Ford, GM, and Stellantis, it still has an upward ceiling. And that upward ceiling is profitability of Ford, GM, and Stellantis. If the money isn't there, they can't ask for it. In the public sector, that's not the case. You're bargaining with government. These are taxing entities that have functionally unlimited budgets, and public sector unions can come to the table and negotiate with people that they themselves have pushed to be elected. So you kind of try and elect your own boss, and then you have this relatively uncapped pool of resources over which you can negotiate. And so public sector unions get all of those advantages. They've got a monopoly. There's no profit or competition motive, and they can just keep ratcheting up the size of government, so they can genuinely argue they have more influence than the private sector does.
I suppose that would explain then why, even as I see entire states like Florida, for instance, their union membership rate in the public sector is cratering. But when I see what's happening still in Pennsylvania, New York, maybe Ohio, I see unions finding brand new swaths of public sector employees to unionize, maybe offsetting some of those losses in different states. Graduate assistants, for instance, are sometimes considered public employees. You've got attorneys general offices and prosecutors and public defenders. These are, in some states, very new. Pennsylvania is still hovering at around 50% union membership, union representation. Still many people left to unionize in the public sector. So that makes sense to me. Well, what does it say about unions? I mean, are unions more interested in the public sector these days versus the private sector?
It's really hard to say. I mean, you can certainly say they've seen more success in the public sector, but I think the unions are looking at the same declining numbers in both sectors that we are, and are kind of scrambling to find membership wherever they can get it. A great example, private sector side, is the UAW. At this point, the UAW represents almost as many, if not more, college professors and graduate students than it does auto workers. So you're seeing that tactic of trying to find new places. This is where you get your Amazons. This is where you get your Starbucks. This is where you get some of the Biden rules that were designed to make it so, hey, joint employer rules, for example. Let's say I'm a barista at Starbucks. I want to unionize. These rules are set to try and unionize by negotiating against Starbucks and having it apply to all of the franchises rather than just an individual franchise. So we're seeing tricks like that where you try to change the law to make it easier to bargain, easier to organize. What I don't think they've done, and I think they need to do, is take a step back and look at how they could add value for members. If you really want to reverse the decline, you've got to change how unions do business, and they've refused to do that so far. For them to come back, that's really the only thing that I could see succeeding, and that is, I haven't seen any union really try to do that.
Let's talk about a watershed moment in labor law, the Janus decision in 2018. This U.S. Supreme Court decision in which U.S. Supreme Court held that public sector unions cannot charge a fee to non-members simply for the privilege of being represented by the union in an unwanted way. So members can still pay dues, but if you choose to be a non-member, you don't have to pay anything to the union. You're still represented forcibly by the union, but you do not have to pay them for that. So I wondered, Mackinac has done some very interesting work in this area. What has the Janus decision done when it comes to union membership, and specifically public sector union membership?
Absolutely. And as you know, Janus only applied to the public sector, so that's where we saw the effects. And what Janus did is essentially, as you said, it brought right-to-work protections for public sector workers in those states that didn't already have a right-to-work law. So think your most union-friendly states would have had laws that required you to continue to pay, whether you wanted to pay the union or not, if you wanted to keep your job. Janus brought that right-to-work style protection to everybody, regardless of state, but really its impact was most notable in the 22, unfortunately now 23 states that have repealed or that don't have a right-to-work law. Michigan is now the 23rd, having repealed its right-to-work law last session. So in those states, employees suddenly had the right to say, look, I can't get to a situation where you don't speak for me, but I can at least not have to be forced to pay for your First Amendment arguments with the government. And what we've seen over the past quite a few years now, I guess 7 years now, is a pretty significant loss in both actual members, people who have left the union, and people who were eligible to join the union but never did. So by our numbers, in terms of who's actually left the union, these are people who were members and said, okay, now that I have this right, I'm not going to be a union member anymore. We had 16.3% of workers leave the union. These are agency fee payers or full dues paying members who said, the union isn't doing what I want it to do, be that spending on politics, not doing a good job representing me, costing too much for the benefits that they provide. I'm leaving.
Okay,
But then
so you're including in that number the folks who they were already paying fees after Janus, if the union presumably stopped charging them those fees in accordance with the ruling, they just kind of fell off. They were no longer what some people refer to as like a partial member of the union paying the union. So you've got those folks, and you've got people who elected affirmatively, I want to leave the union now because I get 100% discount on my dues instead of 80 or 20.
That's exactly correct. And then there's one more tranche of employees, and these are people who would have come into these positions in these states who, without Janus, would have been forced to either be a member or a dues payer, or agency fee payer, I apologize, and said, well, no, I'm never going to join in the first place because Janus says I don't have to. So when you count that third tranche of people, you end up with what we're calling the overall union opt-out rate. This is everybody who would have been forced in to pay at least something without Janus. And that number as of 2024, end of 2024, would have been 28.3% overall union opt-out rate nationwide. So this is the states where Janus went into effect.
So I have to ask, how do you know if someone who's eligible to join but declined to because of Janus, how do you know that they've done so because of Janus?
Well, that is a rabbit hole. So I'll give you the short answer and the longer answer. Right. Because even among those who follow labor policy closely, how you actually go about tracking that number is a subject of not inconsiderable debate. So the way that we do it is we use state open records laws. These are typically called FOIA or FOIL laws, depending on what your state is. And what we do is we send these records requests to all of the individual bargaining jurisdictions that we can identify in the 22 states where Janus had an impact, and say, okay, we would like your payroll records. We want to see who's getting dues deducted, who's within this bargaining unit. And by asking those questions, you can say, okay, we have 100 employees in this bargaining unit. Only 34 of them are getting dues deducted. We know they can't do agency fees anymore. That means that the remaining however many have exercised their rights under Janus. So that's how we go about doing it in the most accurate way possible. There's other methods like using Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, using LM2s, but in our experience, that's how you can really drill down to the absolute most specific level.
Yeah, we were citing BLS numbers a moment ago, but I realize there are some limitations with that. I think they do it by survey and then sort of extrapolate those results out to the larger group. And then with LM2 data, you've got LM2s are the filings that unions do with the Department of Labor. These filings are self-reported filings from the unions. Right, so they may have an incentive to exaggerate their membership numbers.
Well, there's that, and there's also the fact that not everybody has to file an LM2. So you may have, for example, the National Education Association does file an LM2, but whether the Montana Education Association, the state affiliate, does, that's not a guarantee. So you've got self-reporting on that side. It's an incomplete data set. That's also a problem. And the LM2s don't give you that third group of employees. They don't give you the okay, this is who is in the unit. They only give you membership numbers. So LM2s are great for that, but if you're trying to capture the scope of the people who never got pulled into the union apparatus to begin with, LM2 isn't going to do it without a federal reform.
Yeah. Okay, so you give me an example of a 100-member bargaining unit. You got 34 that are members. You assume that the entire 66 were opting out as a result of Janus?
In these particular states. And it's not... we're not looking at it as those 66 all came together and said, we have Janus rights under this 2018 decision. But what we are saying is, without Janus, those 66 would have had the choice between quitting that job or paying at least agency fees. So because they didn't get forced into that situation, they're impacted by Janus, whether they know it or not. They may have no idea what Janus is, but they wouldn't even have that option to not pay were it not for the fact that Janus was decided.
Got it. Well, that makes sense then why you would include both those who've ended their fee relationship with the union and the membership losses. That you're right that they're in the same position when it comes to, no longer paying the union. So the overall union opt-out rate is kind of a measurement of who's not going to have to pay a union that would have had to pay a union pre-Janus. And that number is almost 30%.
It's almost 30%. I would suspect, given the trends that we're seeing, and of course as more people leave or don't join in the first place, it becomes more difficult for that number to go up over time. But presumably, I would expect to see an above 30% overall opt-out rate probably sometime in the next 3 to 5 years if things keep going the way they have.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what kind of money does that mean for the unions? Are they? Can you calculate that?
Yeah, you can. And there's some assumptions that go into this. You essentially have to take an average overall rate for what union dues are. So, union dues in California, for example, are not going to be the same as union dues in Alabama. But if you take kind of a good overall working number for what annual dues are, and you go back to 2018, the overall number in terms of union revenue that would have gone to the union but for Janus, as of 2024, was about $3.6 billion cumulative.
And we're not counting, because of what you've said earlier, we're not counting the other group of states that were right to work prior to Janus. So you could, if you tracked this downward trend here that we talked about at the outset, you could say that unions are losing money in other states as well. This is not captured by the 3.6 billion number that you mentioned. So I thought, Steve, this is remarkable. I thought that Mackinac was doing audits by right to know or FOIA requests, not getting every single employer to answer to this. Is it true? You're getting every single employer to answer these things?
My understanding is that the way that we do this is we FOIA. I can't say every employer. I'm sure we've missed one or two somewhere. But the way my understanding is, we're sending these FOIA requests off to states and the subunits as best we can identify them to get these responses. And we usually get a pretty good response rate to those. There haven't been too many that have just completely ignored us. And my colleague, I have to give him a shout out, Jarrett Skorup, is the master at making all of this run smoothly. But that's the system that we've been using, is relying on FOIA, sometimes an audit, but also this ongoing rolling project of tracking everything.
Yeah. Well, that's remarkable. Now, something else is happening in the world on top of all of this, and Janus is only one of them. There are states where labor reforms are happening. At the Commonwealth Foundation, we do some cataloging of that every 2 years. Can you tell us about some of the states that have had some exciting reforms and how that's affected union membership over the past few years?
Yeah, certainly. And I think the easiest way to do that is to kind of outline the three kind of broad buckets of reform. So when Janus first came out, the reforms were really focused on opt-out efforts. These are efforts to tell existing union employees who are already in the union in these Janus states, hey, this new case came out, you have the right to leave if you want to. Here's how the union is spending your dues money. If you like that, great, you can stay in. That's always been your choice. If you don't like that, if you don't like how they get involved in politics, if you think they're just doing a bad job of negotiating your contract, you can get out now. That was kind of the first wave, this opt-out. And lots of groups have done this and very successfully have informed employees about their rights. What I'll call the evolution of that is what we've started seeing in the past 5-ish years, a little bit beyond that. which is opt-in policy. This is approaching employees, new employees and employees who are still in the union on a regular basis, usually on an annual basis, presenting them with a notice that says, hey, look, you have the right to join, you have the right to not join. You can't be discriminated against for exercising that choice. Janus provides you this option, and that's provided by a state entity on an annual basis to inform employees of their rights, so that each and every year they have to make that choice again. It's much like at the beginning of the year you get a new terms of service update for every online service you get. Same kind of thing with the Janus opt-in notifications. And then more recently, and we can get into this in a moment if you want, but more recently we've seen additional policies come up that are newer but have really had an outsized impact. Recertification is one of these. Florida just passed a couple of years ago, Senate Bill 256. That's been a very significant policy change. We've seen there are some other ones as well that we can talk about, but opt-in, opt-out were really the two core pieces, and now we're seeing states add more and more policies on top of it to protect employees.
And the key to the opt-in is that you're out of the union unless you notify affirmatively, check a box, or sign a piece of paper to say that you want to be in the union the following year, right?
That's exactly right. It's essentially an informed consent requirement on a regular basis. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but a number of groups, including most recently, I think, Institute for the American Worker, have done studies on what percentage of people who are in unions right now ever had a chance to vote on them in the first place. That percentage is consistently like 5 or 6% of all represented employees. Yeah. So inheriting your grandfather's union seems a little bit odd. If you like it, fine. You should be able to keep it, stay in it, vote for it on a regular basis, know what your rights are. But if you're coming into something and you don't like it, you should know what your rights are, and you shouldn't have to jump through hoops to get out of it. They should have to jump through hoops to keep you.
Yeah. So that would seem to have a pretty profound effect on union membership. Are these opt-in policies, is that where they're headed? Are they actually reducing the rate of membership?
Yes, they are. So a lot of these policies, as you may imagine, get tied up in litigation once they're passed. But one clear example we have where it did not was here in Michigan. What we did as a state is the Michigan Civil Service Commission adopted an opt-in framework for all state civil service represented employees. And it was the exact thing you said. You've got to opt in annually. You're opted out unless you affirmatively consent. We saw in a 1 year period the opt-out rate in Michigan go from 22% to 33%. So, we're still tracking the impact of that year over year, but an 11% drop switching from an opt-out to an opt-in framework is something that we can definitively point to in terms of evidence.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, how about recertification? Do we have numbers on what recertification does in terms of union membership?
Yes, we do. So recertification has been tried in a couple of places. Most recently and most successfully has been Florida with SB 256. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I do know that it was a substantial percentage that were that did not meet the threshold. So recertification, to back up, is the idea that, okay, going back to our 100 employees, if you have 100 employees, you should enjoy the support of at least 51 of them to be able to say that you actually are representative of all of them, right? Because unions speak for the full 100. So if you're going to do that, you better have at least a majority. You can decide, is that a 60% threshold, a 50% plus one, what have you, but that's what recertification asks. It asks on a regular basis, how much support do you enjoy? Well, when Florida passed this with SB 256, we saw double-digit percentage union decertifications. These are unions that either were so far below the threshold they didn't try to do what we call recertify, where they hold a new election and say, okay, yeah, so many of you have opted out of paying dues or fees, but we want to, we get a new election, and if enough of you vote for us, we stay. So, and then we've had unions that have just completely said, you know what, we have a unit of 100 people and 2 are paying dues. We're not even going to try to run the election. So those numbers are rolling. They're on an ongoing basis. But it's been a noticeable decline because so many Florida public sector unions just don't have majoritarian support in the form of people who say, yeah, I'm going to pay dues because I believe in what you're doing.
Yeah, I noticed that in Florida there was an outlet that did their own FOIA research and put out the membership numbers for literally every public sector union across Florida, and some of them were 0%, some of them were 14%. Really, kind of surprisingly low support among union represented people, but yet the default for many of these organizations across the country is that they keep their job because nobody's asking that question. How many union members do you have? And but in Florida now they're asking, and they don't automatically lose their certification, as I recall. What they do is they have to file a request for an election if they fall below that threshold, and then people actually have to decide. I suppose you could be a union non-member, refuse to pay the union, but still vote for them and want them to keep their position. I suppose you could do that. So union could still win even if they have very low membership rates. But I have seen a lot of those unions on Florida's website just simply not file for re-election at all. So I don't even know how you measure this, Steve. Like, in Florida, I know that part of their most recent reforms meant that unions couldn't use the public payroll system to deduct dues from people's paychecks. So you can't ask for that data. Where do you go for data in Florida? And for that matter, Wisconsin, that did kind of the same thing back in 2014.
Well, that's an interesting question. So these are good reforms. We like these reforms because workers get a choice, right? But it does complicate the ability to track it. So, you can, once the payroll deduction goes into effect, you're kind of going back to, unless the state has a specific reporting requirement, it's very difficult. And I think if you look at the Florida law, if memory serves, the law very specifically requires, as part of the annual notice process to teachers and other school employees, a breakdown of union membership and support. And then you also have an entity like in Florida, it's PERC, the Public Employment Relations Commission, that gets these reports from the union, right? Because the union has to put together this, okay, I've got my 50% plus 1, 60%, whatever it may be, support. You can then FOIA PERC and get those reports from the union. And Florida also was smart and made sure there was some kind of independent financial, stopping short of a full audit, but some kind of third-party check on those reports. So you can still get those out of PERC. In states that just do, hey, look, we're going to pull out of this payroll collection process without some of that apparatus around it, you do have to go back up the chain and start looking at BLS and LM2s. But with Florida specifically, they still have a robust tracking system that allows us to follow that.
Very interesting. So that the reason I'm so interested in that is not because Florida in particular needs this reform. I mean, it's great, but what I'd like to see is whether it works, and if it works, and whether it accurately reflects employees' choice. That means that it's a good reform for other states to consider. And in Pennsylvania, we've had some bills out there on recertification for a long time. There's a great sense of gut level, I like this bill around Pennsylvania, but I think what would help legislators is to see that it works. I imagine Michigan's the same way.
Oh, certainly. And our preliminary numbers on this, I would say, are very encouraging. So looking at that same publication that you were following, because they do a pretty good job of tracking that data, when we looked at it, the average support among the unions that were at risk of decertification, so we're talking the ones that were 60% or below. They're hovering on the threshold, but they're not the ones that didn't even bother filing. I think the average membership was something like 27%. So you can see that a lot of these Florida unions who didn't meet that threshold were pretty low down there in terms of support. And I think workers agree, and I think that legislators agree, that the general principle is if you want this and you support it, so be it. But if we're going to try and say that a third of employees can speak for the whole, that doesn't make sense even from a traditional collective bargaining mindset. The union's supposed to be talking for a group of employees. If a majority of those employees aren't supporting the union, where's the source of the union's authority? It's in some ways non-democratic once you get to that low level of a percentage.
Well, sure. Yeah, it actually it suggests that we've got a problem with not just the union, but with the public employer, because I've worked with some local governments, and those local governments will tell me sometimes that they actually like the union. They'll say that they like the union because they can basically get all the work on HR matters done at the bargaining table in 1 year and have it all set in place for the next 3 to 5 years. And then they'll tell us that, when something goes wrong and employees don't like what they're paid or what the rules are, we can blame the union. We can say, go talk to the union, go talk to the union. So that the public employer, the county, the city, whatever, has an incentive to have a union in place and doesn't care whether they're representative or not. That was not the goal. The goal is to have a union that they can blame for all the problems that they've created. So, I think in some states it would actually be an unfair labor practice for the public employer, if they have knowledge that the union is not representative of the workers, to continue to bargain with them. They would have what they call a good faith doubt in the majority status of the union, and they shouldn't be bargaining with them anymore. So what they should do is file some kind of a petition to withdraw recognition from the union and have the labor board help them out with that. But they don't do it. I mean, we looked at Pennsylvania one time. It's almost zero over the past 50 years. So it's just something that they probably need help with from above, from the state legislature, to come up with a system like this that will keep both of those entities accountable.
I agree completely. I mean, the incentives surrounding it just don't work for the reasons that you have identified. This isn't, when you think about collective bargaining as a matter of theory, the approach that everybody kind of came up with in 1935 with Wagner and then amended with the Taft-Hartley in 47 was, you have a group of employees, you have the employer. They are hostile towards one another. Their incentives do not align. The employees want more benefits, more money, what have you. The employer, in theory, wants more profits, to maximize profits for shareholders, so they don't want the same thing. But when you talk public sector, as you pointed out, sometimes those incentives don't add up, right? Again, with the loss of profit motive in the public sector, you have a situation of what's convenient for me as the employer, not so much, okay, am I using taxpayer resources wisely? Am I giving workers what they really want? And so without that additional accountability from you, as you said on high, from the state legislature, things don't work as they theoretically should.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we've been talking about states where reform is happening. How about the states where it's not happening? Are you seeing union membership increase in those states that, for instance, have very recently given unions new tools when it comes to recruiting members? They increased their ability to hold employees' attention during employee orientations, like new hires. And they've been getting phone numbers and email addresses and that kind of stuff directly from the public employer so that they can find and communicate with employees. Are their numbers going up?
So I haven't really seen numbers go up. There are states that have enacted laws both in response to Janus and since to do exactly what you say, to restrict the ability of groups to inform employees of their rights, to make it harder. A common technique, and I think New Jersey did this, was implement a statutory windows period where if you wanted to leave your union, great, you only have 10 days to do so. Good luck finding the P.O. box you have to send this to, and if it's not certified in triplicate by the head judge of your county, good luck. So those laws did get passed, and they do present a problem for people who are trying to let workers know what their rights are. But at the end of the day, these states were still almost always, it's almost a one-to-one that the states who are doing those kind of new laws were the states that were affected by Janus. And so you have so many public employees in those states who were freed up by Janus that you're still seeing droves leave. So a great example of this is California. Probably one of, if not the most labor-friendly state in the union. I could see an argument for Washington or Oregon in there, maybe Pennsylvania, but California is a pretty union-friendly state. They've also lost the highest percentage of members. They're down almost 30%, 29.7%. Pennsylvania down 22.8% by our numbers. New Jersey 26%. So yes, those laws make it more challenging, but the numbers are still falling off because at the end of the day, you can put roadblocks in the way of that constitutional right, but it's a constitutional right. You can't get rid of it entirely, and employees are waking up to that fact and are still exercising an opt-out.
Maybe those employees were also the most likely to sort of chafe at some of the restrictions that unions were putting on them, and be most excited about the opportunity that Janus presented.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Well, Steve, thanks for coming on. I appreciate the work that you're doing. Where can we find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Please feel free to check us out at www.mackinac.org, spelled MACKINAC.org. There you can check out our labor policy or any of the other issues that me and my colleagues work on. We're trying to advance free market policies all throughout the country, and would appreciate your eyeballs.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Thank you.